I'm going to talk to you for a while and show you some work, and I hope it goes smoothly. I hope everything's okay. Always makes me nervous to do this, I guess. My favorite Italian philosopher, Yogi Berra, said, "I didn't say everything I said." And I feel the same way about the photographs I've made. I didn't really make all the photographs I made. There's a lot of collaboration that goes on between the photographer and the energy that's going on in the photograph. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more today, because I think it's very important that we realize that we don't do everything we do. I'm going to show you, first off, a little survey of some of the work I've done in Hawaii. I'm going to go pretty fast, and it's an introduction because I only have 45 minutes. In fact, I'm going to press my timer here. And I'll talk a few minutes about each one. And then I'm going to talk about some specific images and things. I think storytelling is part of photography. I started out as a photojournalist, and the stories about places have always been important. I started a project on Wailua when I first came to Hawaii in 1968, and 32 years later, I was still photographing there. The Big Island, I first visited the Big Island a few weeks after I came to Hawaii in 1968 and continued to photograph there also. These are kind of a series from my travels around the Big Island, on the road series, I call it. Waipio Valley was a documentary project I worked on. I'll talk more about Waipio later. Kaho'olawe was a life-changing event for me, and I'll talk about that more later also. The landscape has become very important for me to photograph because that's so much part of Hawaii. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? They have good sound. Portraiture has always been an important part of what I've done to make a living, and I'm going to talk about that first, the work for hire. Portraits, and yes, I do know what a color film looked like in the old days. All my work is not black and white. And the color work I did was mostly for magazines and books. It's what I did to make a living. More recently, a lot of the floral photographs that I've made over the years as kind of a hobby of just being involved in beauty has been helping me make a living also, selling prints of those. So I'm very thankful to have made those over the years now that I'm getting older. And by the way, I'm 73 now, and it gives me a different perspective than than I had. I'm the second oldest person in the room. Ed Greavy's like a little bit older than me. But anyway, it gives you a different perspective on everything you've done. And I'm going to go back just a little bit and talk about some childhood. This is a photograph that my mother made of me when I was about 2 years old. And it's just been a photograph that has motivated, or what should I say, enlightened me over the years about photography is not just something that photographers do. A lot of people have good eyes. And what happened there? Did I press? Oh, thank you. This is my mother on the right, squatting down, photographing me, and one of her photographs of her sister and her friends on the left. And this is what's called vernacular photography. And I think it's very important because I think that through seeing images, we acquire a visual accent, just like through the speech patterns of our family and people in our community. We develop verbal accents, audio accents. One of my favorite photographs has always been Cartier-Bresson's photograph on the right. And when I was working at Magnum in New York City as an intern back in the 60s, when I left, they said, "You can have any print you want." And so I chose this one. So they gave me a print of this. And when I started putting this slideshow together, I realized that photograph that my mother had made, I flipped it from what I had showed you before. And the composition and the feeling to me is like very similar. So my mother and Cartier-Bresson have been my teachers. These are some of my first photographs made when I was about 12 years old of my family at a family picnic. And the family, the community, the church where I grew up, Catholic church and an Italian-American, not quite a ghetto, but a subculture in Southern Illinois, was very important to my development. And I think it was the foundation of what I call a sensual and mysterious vision, because the artwork that was in the church at the time was very much like Renaissance Italian church. So that's what I was first shown. It's my first mysterious photograph of my father standing in the front door of our house. And this is my first commercial photograph. When I was 14 years old, there was a train explosion, gas tank in our hometown, and I wanted to rush over to photograph it, and I was only 14, so I had to ask my dad to drive me over to the scene of the accident. So he took me over, I made the photograph, and it was published in the local newspaper, my first published image. And that's a self-portrait of myself about that same time. I went to school at Southern Illinois University in 1960 and majored in photojournalism. And at the time, there was a very big influence by the Farm Security Administration photographers who had documented the Depression. One of my teachers had actually worked with Rothstein and some of the other people that came to photograph in my hometown. So I became very early on, I became aware of the ability to be the observer witness to different events, different lifestyles, different things that were going on in the world through my journalistic connections. And in 1962, I put this in before all the stuff that started happening this past few weeks, about the Confederate flag and everything. But I grew up in a southern town. Southern Illinois is 500 miles south of Chicago, but north of parts of Kentucky, or even south of Kentucky, I'm sorry, and 200 miles from Memphis and Nashville. So the mindset there is very southern. In '62, the civil rights demonstrations started in Cairo, which is the southernmost town in Southern Illinois, and I got I guess embedded is the word we use now. I started hanging out there and photographing and documenting that. A lot of my visual influence came from what was just coming to America at that time, the new wave European films, the new Japanese film, post-war films, and the way the vision of those filmmakers saw the world. And a lot of these films would show at the late night art theater that was in the college town where I was. I showed this because of the technology. This was my first summer job, telephoto operator for United Press International in Chicago in the Tribune Tower. And that's the contraption we used to send photographs over the wire, so to speak. There was a little scanner over on the right, and you had to, dial the phone number and find someone at the other end and make a connection and say, okay, transmitting now, and you plug in one of those cords like, in the old movies, and you send the photograph anywhere in the world. So I thought you'd like to see that. I was a bit of a nerd, I guess, at that time. In 1963, I made my first trip to New York City and by car, and then in 1964 I flew there and I had an internship for the summer and started doing street photography in New York. This was made about the same time that Gary Winogrand's famous photograph of some girls on the park bench. I don't know if any of you know that image. Within a couple of months of each other. Strangely enough, it's like one of those simultaneous things that happens in life. You know, you see a photograph somebody else made and say, hey, I made that same thing, right? So street photography became a lot of what I did, and eventually I ran off to Europe and Sweden for a while. Spent a year over there. It was interesting in Sweden, photographing in below zero weather all the time in the winter, you know, photographing the snow, but I found that very interesting. In 1966, I guess, I came back to America and enrolled in art in an MFA program at Ohio University in the art department. And that kind of changed my vision also. To be working in art rather than working in photojournalism was a big switch. And when I was at Southern Illinois University, and I'll talk more about this later, I'll talk about it now. There was a big influence of what they call the new Bauhaus. A lot of the Bauhaus people from Europe who escaped during World War II came to the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. Mahalinaj and just a whole bunch of Hungarian artists, photographers, graphic designers. And they ended up coming down to Southern Illinois University also, which was developing a very big design program. Buckminster Fuller was there. And it was an incredible input from that whole period of visual history in the world. The idea of synchronicity, superimposition, and simultaneity was very big at that time in the design community. And I developed a pinhole camera on the left that had 5 different lenses to it, so I could do all of this. One image, one exposure created this look. And I started working with that, and that became my studio thesis for the MFA. After I finished the program, I started looking for jobs and sending queries out, resumes, and I got a call from Hawaii. And so I said, well, I don't know. It wasn't very much money. I'd never been there, you know. It's like, where is this place? I didn't know anything about it. And so I went on another job interview in Northern Illinois University, and it was terribly depressing. It was absolutely awful. I went back to the Holiday Inn, sat down at the bar to have a drink, and looked up at the TV, and the first Don Ho TV special had just come on. And so I'm sitting there with a telegram saying, come to Hawaii, and I'm sitting in, you know, just right outside of Chicago in this slum town, you know. And, well, why not? So I came to Hawaii. That's how I got here. Dwayne Preble. Are you here today, Dwayne? There he is in the back. Dwayne was actually responsible for making me that job offer, and I'm eternally grateful to him, and I don't know why he did it, but I'm happy to be here. This, by the way, is one of my first photographs I made in Hawaii, my first trip to the North Shore. I know there's a lot of surf people here today, and I show you this because that's the way things looked back then, you know, all those years ago, before digital cameras and, you know, super color and, you know, long, cheap lenses on the shoreline. I am also convinced that this surfer has to be someone very special. His position, surfing a wave that size in 1968, there weren't very many people out there. So I would really like to know who this is, if anyone has a connection to that, just out of curiosity. Well, as soon as I got here, my life changed because there wasn't enough salary at the university to really support me and my family. So I started taking some jobs. My first job was an archaeological project on the Big Island to survey the area that we now know as the Kealohoi Point Airport and the Queen Ka'ahumanu Highway. And at that time, they took us in on a helicopter and dropped us down and left us there for a week. I almost died from some kind of infection I got but I survived. Coming back, going to the Kona airport, and these are the baggage handlers. You knew you were in a different part of the world when the baggage handlers would come out and hang out like that in the lobby between flights. I came back to Honolulu, and immediately my wife and I split up. We'd been here 3 months, and I didn't know what I was going to do. So somebody at the university, I was teaching at the university, so somebody said, you know, there's this place up in Manoa, AG House. Would you like to live there? I said, well, I'll go take a look. And so I drove up, and AG House was right before the, where the entrance to the Manoa Falls Trail is. And so if you go across the Manoa Falls Trail, there's a very small bridge. You could see AG House from that bridge. It was this 15-room redwood house built by the guy, Mr. Agee, who was head of the Board of Water Supply at the time. And they had permission to live there until he died, and then it reverted back to the state. The art department took it over, and they had studios up there. And so this is one of my first photographs I made in AG House with my pinhole camera that I brought from Ohio with me. That's looking out of my bedroom window. There were figure drawing classes, there were painters up there who had their studios, and I started photographing. It was an incredible place. This room was the most beautiful studio. It was an 18-foot high by about 15 feet wide window looking out into the rainforest, so the light was absolutely fantastic. It was the days of hippies and Hawaiians, is how I relate to it. There was this merger of these two cultures going on in 1968, 69. It was pretty amazing. And I started doing my street photography in Hawaii. So these are some of the early photographs I made at that time. Making connections to the different communities was an interesting thing. And early on, I met Wanikiala Akaka on the right. And that's her on the left, you can see at the Valkeli Opuna demonstration. She introduced me to a lot of people who were involved in the Hawaiian movement, the early Hawaiian movement at that time. And she's still very involved. She was just arrested again last week for being up on Mauna Kea for the TMT demonstrations. I saw her mugshot in the paper in March when she was arrested for the 31 who got. So she was very instrumental in introducing me to a lot of people. And one of the people she introduced me to was Uncle Sam Lono in Haiku Valley. And I met him, and I encountered him again a few years later on my first trip to Kaho'olawe in February 1976. And I don't know what to say about that. It was just one of the most incredible experiences, a change of consciousness for me to be involved in that. And at that time, Ed Greevy, who's going to speak later, was photographing a lot of political protests. And I became more involved in the cultural aspect of what was going on. So between the two of us, we've done a lot of the same, we've covered some of the same territory, but in a sense from different perspectives. And I think that's kind of interesting. Went to Kaho'olawe the first time, and on the left, the Navy came in and scooped us off, wouldn't let us stay. The photograph on the left of Auntie Emma DeFries was my first exposure on Kaho'olawe. I was seasick. They threw me off the boat and threw me an inner tube. My camera had been wrapped in plastic, and so I floated to the shore, and a wave threw me down. I looked up, and that's what I saw. It was just such an amazing thing. I want to say now, I'm not Hawaiian, and whatever I've learned about the culture is my own interpretation. I'm going to show you a lot of photographs from the Hawaiian world. It's stuff that's been taught to me, I've been exposed to, and I've embraced this in an attempt to understand where I am and who I'm working with and help me make better photographs. I wanted to document this rich and transitory time for the future. So I kept up with it. And this was the beginning. Uncle Harry Mitchell on the right, during the Kaho'olawe protests and everything, Kimo Mitchell and George Helm were lost at sea. And Kimo was the son of Uncle Harry, and he composed the song Melio Kaho'olawe, which became the anthem for the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana and the movement. So that's him singing that song at Hakeolava Bay, where Kimo and George had left from. So it's a very poignant photograph for me. In, I think about 1995, Jay Jensen at the Contemporary Museum asked me to participate in the biennial. And I took some of the Kaho'olawe photographs. I think of this as Kaho'olawe Part 2. The first part was documentation, and this is photography as interpretation and metaphor. So I started making these, taking these photographs I had made and putting them on metal. They're just like 30 by 50 inches. The prints are like 20 by 24 paper. And rubbing them with dirt and graphite and ash and stuff to try and get a feeling of the degradation that was going on to Kaho'olawe, even putting red earth on it from the erosion and everything. The first one was the diptych form, trying to show the conflict between the Hawaiian culture and the military presence. And this one I was trying to focus on the idea of the warrior, the military warrior versus the Hawaiian warrior. The military warrior is holding his gun, the Hawaiian warrior is holding his fish. So it's a symbol of the cultural difference between these two things. Two worlds, actually. In 1971, this is not chronological, by the way, totally. I quit the university and bought a round-the-world ticket. I was just going to travel for a while. I got to Japan, spent a couple of months, and got very sick in the winter, and came back to Hawaii. And then went back again in 1972 because my girlfriend was living there, and came back again. And when I came back, I realized that you got to make a living. So I started doing commercial photography. One of the first calls I got was to do a portrait of this woman, Anna, in Waikiki, who wanted to try out for a television program called The Little People, and she needed a portrait of herself for that. And so I went to Waikiki and went up to the roof of her apartment and was photographing her. I made this portrait of her. And as I was photographing, I got very dizzy. I couldn't stand up. I almost fell over, not off the roof, but collapsed. So she said, well, come down to my apartment and I'll make you some tea and you'll feel better. So I picked up my camera on the tripod, went down to her apartment. She made some tea. And as I was sitting there and drinking my tea, she came out from behind her. It was a studio apartment. She was behind her screen, and she came out, and she was wearing a pink negligee. And she said, now make the picture. And I stood up. She threw the negligee over her head like a veil, and I just clicked the shutter, 2 frames. It's called Apparition of She. She was a character in an H. Rider Haggard 19th century novel of a person in Africa who was thousands of years old. She had the old face, but her body was still very young. So this is that. The interesting thing about this, though, not just all of that, but when I went home and I developed the film, I looked at the film and I called my girlfriend into the darkroom. I said, did I tell you about a dream I had last night? And she said, yeah. And I said, look at this photograph. And she looked and says, that's the photograph you described in your dream last night. So this was another entry into this whole other world. After that, we moved back to the Big Island. She was a Big Island girl. Moved to Hilo, and I was still sick from the Japan trip. I sold all my cameras. I was going to quit photography. We moved over there just to recuperate. I kept one Leica, and I had been going back and forth to the Big Island a lot in the early 70s and been making a lot of photographs. Suisan, a lot of historic stuff in there. This burned down recently. Things trying to catch the culture. You know, the Mamo Theater is gone. It collapsed one day several years ago from the termites taking out the last bit of support from it. On the left, I love the Obasan with the Kamaboko slippers. I think I stand back a lot from my photography. I'm not into close-ups so much. And I think because the environment is so important to know, it gives clues about the period and everything. So you see this Kamaboko slippers on her. She looks like she could be 19th century. But we know that the slippers didn't start being sold in that form until about 76 or something, 77. So I like those little details. About that time, 1974, Mary Matayoshi at the, what was called continuing education at the time, asked me to go down to Waipio Valley and photograph because there was the Hamakua Community Development Corporation was involved in a lawsuit with a guy who was building a huge house, concrete house in Waipio, and had taken the electrical, there was no electricity in Waipio. It was still a 19th century kind of place. And he had brought electrical wires in. So they wanted to document that. So I started photographing Waipio. And for many years, actually, it was another one of those long-term projects. And during that time, I became aware of the whole idea of the Vahipana, the traditional cultural places, and the idea of Valakua and the Kinolau, the wilderness of the gods and the manifestations of the gods in the landscape. And these two photographs really, I think, speak of that. The top of Mauna Kea and Pu'upuai at Volcano, two very powerful places. At that time, I was still, 1976, 1977, I'd gotten back into photography. I was trying to make a living. And this is, I think, a great example of how a commercial assignment leads to a certain kind of alchemy that takes place, and you end up with so much more than you ever could have expected. I was commissioned to a photograph of Auntie Edith Kanakaole for the cover of her first record album back then, not a CD, but a 33 1/3. And so we went off into, she said, where do you want to do it? And I said, well, how about up in Volcano there? It's an album of Pele Chants, that would be the logical place. So we went to a couple of different locations, and we came to what used to be called Bird Park. And she and her daughters went in, sat down. And at one point she stood up and she looked at me. I was sitting on the grass, you know, they were just hanging out, chanting and, you know, talking and stuff. And she said, are you ready to make the picture? And I realized, again, it was another one of those moments that somebody's giving you a gift. They're giving you this opportunity. And so I stood up and made this photograph of her, and it's become, I guess, a classic photograph over the years. And so I have a whole lot of gratitude for her and her family for bringing me into that world. I photographed them for many years, actually, for their CD covers and everything. Sam Ka'ai was another person who has given me a lot of inspiration and teaching. I had met Sam, I'd been in Hawaii for a couple of months, and I first met him over on Maui when he had I guess it was an antique store in Lahaina. And that's him holding one of the figures he had carved for the stern post of the Hokulea. And I had to photograph for a magazine story in this case. And it was just another one of those wonderful moments, you know, the figure with that eye looking out at us. And Sam, with his inner vision that he had, so I asked him to close his eyes because I know he can see without seeing, in a sense. And I just love the way the reflection and all of that really worked. It was just back on the outside of his house, as a background. It wasn't any kind of a special place or anything. And then he got me involved in the ho'oku'ikahi ceremony at Pu'ukohola, which was a reunification of the families from the Kamehameha time. And this is still going on every year. They're still restaging this. So it was the beginning of something really amazing. I'm going to take just a little different tack here now. To see is to forget the name of the thing one sees. And that's going to be a theme for the next little part of the show here. I'm going to have to start going a little faster, actually. And it's going to be an entry into what we think of as the metaphysical world. I love the literalness of photography, but I also love the idea that it can be a metaphor. It can be something that means something completely different than what it is. And at this time, I was introduced to the concept of the kauna in the Hawaiian language, where the kauna is the hidden meaning or concealed meaning within something, where words have double meanings. And from this, I realized that photographs have other meanings also. The two words in this, vaiapo, refers to the water that's caught in the taro leaf that's sitting there. It's sacred, I guess, because it hasn't touched the earth, although the earth is sacred too. I never understood that. And the other term is vaioku'unu, which refers to that same water, but the literal translation of that is thrilling discharges of love. So this idea of the sacred and the worldly within the Hawaiian language really struck me as something that's quite incredible. And I started looking for that a little bit more in my work. I came to a place on the Big Island that my wife took me to. She used to go there as a child, Lele'iwi Point, which is Keaukaha, outside of Hilo. And Meliana used to live over there too, didn't you? Yes. And it's an incredible place. It's a vortex of energy. It's an important Hawaiian place. I started photographing. And I started teaching classes at the University of Hawaii Hilo, and we were doing a figure photography class, and I took a model out there, Gwen, and I had her lying down in the grass. And I was demonstrating a 4x5 view camera to the class. So it was all set up on the tripod. I'm under the black cloth. I'm stopping. I'm describing film holders and all this stuff. And Gwen's just lying there in the grass. And so I turned around and I looked, and as she was lying there, it took us so long, the tide started coming up. So suddenly she was not just lying in grass, she was lying in the water. And it was a gray day, and so I looked under the hood, the dark cloth, and just I did that, the sun came out, and she had been wearing some kind of sandalwood oil or something on her body, and it started floating off into the water and created this rainbow kind of effect around her head. Interesting enough, I ended up titling this The Birth of Isis. Isis was the Egyptian goddess, and she was the patroness of nature and magic. So another one of those photographs that just kind of, changed my orientation toward the world. At that same time, or around that time, Walter Chappell, a very well-known American photographer, came to Hawaii, and he moved into a house next to me. We started sharing a studio, and Walter was a true metaphysical photographer. He was part American Indian, had studied the Gurdjieff philosophy, had worked with Minor White, who David also worked with in Boston, and always said his photographs are about all and everything. And when the Aperture issue came out about him, the writing called his photographs roadmaps to inaccessible places. And I think that's such a beautiful phrase, you know, and I like to use that. So I started photographing more. There's a long story that goes with this. I'm going to have to start, you know, speeding up a little bit. It has to do with a photograph that Walter missed and I got because the wind blew the banana leaves over. And that taught me to always be aware of what you're photographing and do it now. You know, don't wait 5 minutes. So I started photographing more inner things, you know, self-portraits, photographing myself, my friends and family, my grandmother. And this body of work became a portfolio called Spirit, Flesh, and Stone. My grandmother was the first inspiration. This was made about a month before she died at age 94. And again, she's the one who gave me this closed eyes feeling about things, you know, how you can see inside, because she had some kind of an affliction and she was blind and her eyes were closed. Torso with hands became, this is the flesh, in a sense, part of that. The Hawaiian pohaku, the petroglyphs inscribed in them became the stone. So I started working more with that idea, working with my family, friends, people who were around, with myself again. And in about I can't remember what year this was, maybe 95, I guess, because it was the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And Lori Otani, who was a Buto performer who had used to dance with Iona Pear, was asked to do a performance for that, and she needed a poster. So we started making some photographs in my living room, actually. And this is the photograph we made at that point. It wasn't quite going quite so well, and I looked over and there was this rock just sitting on my table. I picked it up, put it in her hand, and that's what brought the photograph together. You know, it's something that you just never know what's going to happen. And you just try whatever. I'm a photographer who works by experience and what's going on rather than conceptually. So I'm always trying to keep my eye open for what's happening. I want to look at these three photographs because these are three of my, I guess, my favorite photographs that I've made. And although they have certain formal qualities about them, even though they're very different, there are similarities. For one thing, the three women are all devoted to dance forms. Auntie Edith, the hula, Lori, the Buto, and on the right, my model was, she was a Tahitian dancer when she was younger, and now she dances with Auntie Edith's halau over on the Big Island. What is common between these for me is the sense of movement and the release and resonance of energy. So to me, these are energetic photographs. They're not necessarily photographs of just those people. In 2001, I went to Italy. I needed a vacation. I had moved back to Honolulu in 1984. And so I needed to get away. So I went to Italy and made some photographs there. Came back. And I was in a show at I forget where it was. Anyway, this photograph, Dream Search for the Seat of the Soul, was another one of those instances. I was at Hui Noiau at Kaluanui is the name of the house, the old Baldwin family home on Maui up in Makawao, a Dickey house built in 1917. And I woke up in the morning and I knew there was a photograph in the room. There's also a ghost in the house. And so I got up out of bed, I made a photograph of the window and thought, well, this needs something else. So I put the camera on the bed with self-timer and I stood in front of the window myself and made this photograph. So it's another one of those strange instances. After Italy, I started looking at some of my family photographs some more. And there's a lot of photographs of death. It's really big in the Italian Catholic culture. They like death. And as an altar boy, I used to like death too because we got tipped 25 cents for serving at a funeral, whereas only got 10 cents for a wedding. So funerals are much more valuable. That was ingrained into my mind. So again, I had a show at the Academy of Arts, as it was known at the time, and I did a series called Regarding Death. And this was kind of a bit of a premonition, I guess, the whole idea of death at that time, because I came back to the mainland to see my mother. I left on September 9th, I think, on my way to New York. I had a flight to New York from St. Louis on September 13th, and everybody knows what happened 9/11, right? So I was stuck in Huron, Illinois, and this is one of the photographs. This is how they deal with that in the Midwest, you know, put signs up on the advertising. At that time, I realized that my mother was beginning to suffer from dementia, and she was going to need some help. So my sister and I, my sister, by the way, is over here. She just came in from Boston to visit a few days ago, so I'm happy to see Gigi. We realized that Mom needed some help, and so after a couple trips back and forth that we were making, we moved her to St. Paul, Minnesota, where my sister was living, and I rented a house next door, and we took care of my mom. So this is the last photograph of my mother in front of her home, and that's a self-portrait of me and my mom. I didn't have a dark room, but I had a Polaroid camera, and I was using black and white Polaroid film and making little cyanotype prints on that stuff you buy at the museums stores called sun prints, little cyanotype thing. You can probably buy it at Treehouse, at Bobby Asato's place too. Anyway, I started photographing my mother a lot and working on this project called Dementia and Transience. My main camera was a little plastic Diana, which I'd had since the 1960s. And I found that the softness of the focus and everything of that camera was actually quite perfect for transmitting the idea of dementia. And so I tried to keep that in mind when I'd go for a walk in the afternoon. I'd try to make photographs that held that idea of how my mother was seeing the world. And I realized that putting them together in triptychs with photographs of her and with these other photographs really worked very well. I came back to Honolulu on one trip, and I did this photograph for a show at the Japanese Cultural Center for Obon, another death photograph. So I was really into death at this time. And it's a couple of photographs that have been burned and put onto a bed of ash and everything. And what inspired this was this saying by Suzuki Roshi from Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind book. When you do something, you should burn yourself completely, like a good bonfire, leaving no trace of yourself, completely burned out, with nothing remaining but ashes. So that's become a very important teaching for me too. When I was caring for my mom, I was back and forth to Hawaii, and I know I've only got about 3 minutes left here. So going back and forth to Hawaii, I was having some hip problems before my hip replacement surgery, and I couldn't walk very much. So I started photographing the clouds and the ocean so I could just sort of stand in one place and let them move. I could be stationary and the clouds moved, the ocean moved, and started doing these little images. In the 80s, I had been doing this work where I call them mandalas that I was making, where I would take one image and flip it a couple of times and then put the prints together to form a very specific kind of an image. And one of them was of clouds, like you see here. So at this time, the digital camera was becoming quite ubiquitous, and I wasn't doing any assignment work because I'd been away and I think I'd been forgotten about. And I didn't have a digital camera good enough to work for a magazine anymore. But I did have a little point and shoot. And so I discovered this program in Photoshop that you can use, Contact Sheet. And I started putting these things together where I do a sequence of images and put them together in Photoshop and create this, these images. This one has 99 photographs in it. And I couldn't do this by hand. I don't think I'd have the patience for cutting out that many photographs and everything. So that's kind of the story of traces, which takes us up to the present moment. And what I'm doing now photographically is mostly walking around with my little Leica Deluxe 5 point and shoot, which Ed Greavy sold me used after he got a Deluxe 6. So that's the camera I use most of the time, and I'm just kind of wandering around making photographs. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'd like to come back to Auntie Edith because I'm going to close my program here with a little story about this. If I had to choose one photograph from my life to represent everything, this would be it. And I was invited to be in a show at the Contemporary Art Center, the Forerunner Contemporary Museum, many years ago, and it was called Men Look at Women. And I thought, well, I know what kind of work most of the guys are going to put in. I think I'll put this photograph of Auntie Edith in. So I asked her permission, and I asked her for a title for the photograph. So her and her daughters, they were at the Halau was having a party about a block away from me, so I was over there. And they started talking and everything. And she said, okay, here's the title. Ulu'ae kevalina ake aloha. The growth of love is the essence within the soul. And she said, every time you show that photograph, I would like for you to tell people this, because it's a very important thing for everybody to know. So, for me, I'm eternally grateful for this, and it's an example of the collaboration that I was talking about when I first started between all of these people that I've showed you photographs. I could not have made these just as a conceptual idea that I was going out. And this photograph, although it has I think a lot of formal qualities, it's got balance, it's got all the stuff that photographers are always looking for, the golden thirds probably even, or whatever that is, the light, the background. But it combines with the inner focus that Auntie has, her expression, her naturalness of movement, and the gesture. So these formal qualities are just the surface. And so to kind of wind up this idea of what else is the photograph about, it's about the energy of Auntie Edith. And she's revealing the essence of the image itself by that. And I think that's what the photograph is about. And that's all I have to say.